Contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. In times of spiritual and moral chaos, it can be hard to discern truth from error and to apply it to all of life. God's word is not silent, and we don't have to be either. This is Once for All Delivered with Caleb Castro and Andrew Smith.
Welcome to episode 2, I guess, of Once for All Delivered. I am Andrew Smith, your co-host.
And I am your other co-host, Caleb Castro. Yeah, we're...
Good to be...
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing.
Well, fine.
We can both
it's good
say
to
it.
be with... Okay. It's good to be with you. This is... what a mess. It's good to be with you once again as we dive again into the topic of nature and grace, part of our broader series, The Christian and Culture, laying background and foundations for this discussion of issues of Christianity and culture. We need to understand the basic theological categories that undergird that discussion, and one is this relationship between nature and grace. So by way of brief review, last time we went over a very big picture of the various views of nature and grace. We talked about how the Roman Catholic view was of grace perfecting nature. We talked about the Lutheran view, essentially grace ignores nature or passes over nature. And we talked about the Anabaptist view where basically grace replaces nature, or there was another word. What was the other Anabaptist one? Grace obliterates nature, destroys nature. Thank you. And then we talked about the typical Reformed view, which is that grace renews nature. Now, we only hit that briefly because the rest of what we're doing in the series is going to be making a case based on that position for how Christians should engage culture. But what we wanted to do today is give some of the scriptural, confessional background and the case for that view of nature and grace, the view of grace renewing, grace restoring nature. So that's what we are going to do, the Lord willing.
That is what we're going to do. And I suppose a good place to start, we can talk a little bit here about, first of all, the fall, too. Creation and the fall.
Yeah. Kind of need creation before the fall.
It's true. That does come first.
Yes.
In the beginning.
Yes, in the beginning. I've recently begun a series preaching through the Gospel of John, and when you say in the beginning, you're talking about the beginning, not just any old beginning. But just as that's where John begins, it's where we have to begin as we look at this idea of nature and grace. As we hinted at last time, what you think about nature and grace is going to have a lot to do with what you think about issues like creation, the image of God, the state of the original creation, and then what is lost in the fall, and then what is regained in redemption. And so we need to sketch these doctrines and the issues pertinent in them to our nature and grace discussion. So, creation. We need to lay out how was man created, and particularly how does nature and grace, how do those come in terms of the original creation, and why does this matter?
Yes. So, creation, what is it? In the beginning, God created. So for those with their Bibles, they're with them or nearby, or you've already, this creation narrative in Genesis 1, God goes and lays forth by his authority through his word and by his spirit speaks things into existence. After forming the heavens and the things of the earth and the beasts, the fish, the birds, I know those aren't in order, God created man. And here we have in particular that well-known passage from Genesis 1:26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." And so God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female, and blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. And then God gives every seed-bearing plant and tree with fruit for food. So, here I'm using the Christian Standard Bible at this moment. I do like to switch between certain versions, but right now I'm using the CSB as one of my favorites for Hebrew translation. So what do we make of this, Andrew? What are a couple key things here?
Well, for one thing, you got to be careful about those order of things of creation, because you wouldn't want to be accused of, like, say, holding to a framework view or something.
Uh-oh. We'll get into that.
Dun, dun, dun. Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun.
Not this time. Or will we get into it? I don't know.
Who knows?
It's really hard. It's often hard to tell where we're going and how we'll get.
Well, there's, I think, like, just as a sidetrack of that, I mean, that is an interesting thing for, again, another discussion, but what we're not going to be handling here is the days of creation. That's another big one, right? Literal young earth, old earth, poetic device, mythology, whatever. So maybe another time.
Yeah. Although, I mean, what you think about that may well, and really in certain ways will affect how you deal with some of the rest of this. But what we do have is, first off, we do have, on the sixth day, the special creative act of man. Man is created differently from the other creatures and from the other things of creation. God forms him out of the dust. God breathes life into him, gives him a soul, gives him a spirit, and with that gives him the image of God. To read from chapter 4, section 2 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, it says, after God had made all other creatures, he created man, male and female. And then it goes on to list several of the important details of this, with reasonable and immortal souls. So that's one thing that we see that's different from other creatures. Endued with knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness after his own image. So that's important as we're going to talk about the image, this knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. Having the law of God written in their hearts and power to fulfill it, and yet under a possibility of transgressing, being left to the liberty of their own will, which was subject unto change. And then the next part, I don't know if I might save that for a little later. It talks about the command, the covenant of works. I don't know if that's pertinent to where we're going right now.
There's some relation there, I'd say. We'll see how we tie in.
Beside this law written in their hearts, they received a command not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which while they kept, they were happy in their communion with God and had dominion over the creatures. So, we see several aspects of this creation, and then we also see the logically distinct and subsequent act of God making a covenant. I guess we were going to get there. Sequence.
We plan things.
Can't not do sequence. So, what do we learn here that helps us in understanding nature and grace? So we have reasonable and immortal souls. This is not something that other creatures have. Sorry to say, not all dogs go to heaven. They don't have eternal, reasonable, immortal souls. They're not your children. Sorry, I'm going to veer off into... We'll just leave that one aside. I don't want to go on a rant from which we'll never recover. But yeah, so this is something distinct to man. And then there is this knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness, which constitutes the image of God. Now, why does that matter when we're talking about nature and grace? Well, this knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness is what is damaged, is what is shattered in the fall. In fact, some of the older Reformed theologians, I can think of, for instance, Ursinus in his commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism and others, they go so far as to say the image of God is lost in the fall. Other theologians, more recent theologians, moderate that a little. They say the image remains, or shattered fragments of the image remain. In fact, I've got a quote from Bavinck I might read here in a second. But yeah, we have... And this is important because, as we talked about before, like, for instance, with the Roman Catholic position, they believe what was lost in the fall, well, just the superadded gift, the abilities to subdue and suppress concupiscence. That's quite a different position from what Reformed theology, as we see here in the Westminster Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism treats it very similarly, pertaining to what constitutes the image and what is lost in the fall.
Andrew, what is concupiscence in a nutshell?
So, in the Roman Catholic view, sinful desires, sinful inclinations do not become sin until they are acted upon. So concupiscence is what accounts for these sinful desires. It is this predisposition of natural man to sin. Now, they would say that exists as much before the fall as after, with the difference being before the fall, there is the super added gift to subdue concupiscence, and then once that's lost, then sin reigns. This is very different from the Reformed position regarding sin, which treats sinful desires as themselves truly and properly sinful.
Right. Like, just for example with that, I can't recall if we brought it up last time. We probably did. But just for a reiteration then, we think of things in Matthew 5 during Jesus' teaching of the Beatitudes, which is really just an expansion on the law of the kingdom. He says in Matthew 5:28, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And likewise, he says also that in 5:22, anyone who is angry with his brother is also subject to the fires of hell. So already right there, even though that's a New Testament teaching, the Lord is expanding upon what is the law and right in God's eyes. And so this would tie into a question then of which we'll get into, but how does the law, in a sense, function before the fall? Which, in a way, Andrew, you've already read from the Westminster Catechism implicitly, if I recall.
Confession.
From the Westminster Confession, the WCF. That God, and likewise what we have in our Heidelberg Catechism in question answer 9, doesn't God do injustice by requiring in his law what man is unable to do? And the answer says no, God created man with the ability to keep the law. You hear that? God created man with the ability to keep the law. So there's a conflict there then if we're talking about there being a desire or temptation in drawing into sin before the fall. That would mean that temptation or desire, rather, specifically, is sin.
And really, I mean, these things that I listed here, the knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness, which itself draws from the language of Colossians 3:10 and Ephesians 4:24, these things which constitute the image, all of them presuppose revelation, and particularly they presuppose revelation of law. Knowledge requires an object. There is something that must be known. And in this case, it is the knowledge of who God is and what he requires. Righteousness, the same, presupposes a law. It is the law that dictates what is righteous. And then true holiness, too. That is perfection. That is wholeness. That is completeness under the law. And that's why I also hinted at this logical relation between creation and covenant. I think it is very clear here from the way that the confession presents this. And I think it's just, true is what arises from a plain reading of the scriptural text too. Man is created under the law, and that is prior to covenant. You can even read the account like God creates man, and then once he is created, he gives the terms of the covenant that you shall not eat of the tree in Genesis 2, for if on the day you do, you shall surely die. So that's why we make that distinction. So the law is fundamental. It is basic in this creation in God's image of man.
Yeah, I think I mentioned last time as well that we have to understand the law and its relation to revelation in the revealing of God's will. Like there's God's hidden will, we call it. There's God's decrees, the things that he says shall be, as he's a sovereign God over everything. He knows everything that's going to happen because he ordains them for happen before the foundations of the earth. We don't know all of that, though. We only know what's revealed through his word and by the Spirit, and those things that which are necessary for salvation. This being the case, we don't know God's hidden decrees, his purposes for why he does things, for what he is about to do. We won't ever know that full picture because we won't know the mind of God in its entirety. Only God does. But we do know his revealed will, and that revealed will is through his law. That law is God's own holiness or morality. It's based in God's holiness. This is why we say the law is an eternal thing. And so the law is before the fall, because it's then afterwards that you need the gospel, because there has to be that restoration. Andrew, if we could point out here, we've been using the term knowledge, right? And this knowledge of God. How could we define this knowledge? What kind of knowledge are we talking about, and what does that do?
So when we are talking about the knowledge of God, and I mean, if you listen back to our old Bobcast archive, mm-hmm. I mean, we spent several chapters mm-hmm. and several months talking about what constitutes the knowledge of God. But in this case, as we're talking about, the knowledge of God before the fall, it is the revelation that God exists, and that God has implanted on the hearts of man a moral law, and man is accountable to him in it. But it is more than that. It is also that God has blessed man in certain ways, given him the world, given him dominion over the world, given him the ability to work the garden and keep it, and to rule over the creatures, and to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. All these things are comprehended even before covenant.
So here what you're saying is it's even though, say, the Westminster Confession uses the word, say, reason, we're not talking about just an intellectual understanding, but or an intellectual knowledge, but a holistic knowledge, a whole person from the head and the heart, and displayed through actions and course of living, an understanding of God, or the understanding of one's self in relation to God, in relation to one's neighbor, and in relation to the world around us, to creation. So it's understanding one's state and standing as a human, standing before God and this world around us. And therefore, there is then a knowledge, or a right knowledge, that comes before the fall. Man had to have known God. Adam had to have known God, and so did Eve, because he alone is the source of existence and the satisfaction of one's existence. And so what the fall does then is which we'll get into more here in just a moment. The fall is a shattering of that understanding of one's existence and state. It is a blinding to the things of God, and a corruption of our understanding of ourselves and what we're supposed to do in this world. And so when knowledge comes in the renewal, we emphasize that word renewal, through the Holy Spirit, knowledge is renewed, and then causing the scales, so to speak, from falling off the eyes, causing one to see again, and to know one's fallen state, and to know that they are lost apart from God's means of delivering us, which is Jesus Christ through faith alone.
Yeah, absolutely. So important in this nature grace discussion from a Reformed perspective. It's not only creation and fall, but what is lost in the fall and how it is given back. And so there are some divergent views, even in the Reformed camp, among what is the image of God and what is lost in the fall. Like, for instance, Meredith Quine, who, if you're familiar with our past work. You probably know I'm not a huge fan of Meredith Kline. I think he's kind of messed some things up. And I think we need to, just as my own tangent, we need to be honest about this. Right now, it's the 100th anniversary of Kline's birth, and there's been a lot of accolades and tributes and conferences and stuff about Kline. Sometimes Kline was innovative and speculative in some ways that I think aren't helpful, and I think kind of knock us off of our Reformed confessional theology and foundations. And this is one of those issues, is he takes the view that when God says, let us make man in our image, it is God taking counsel with his divine counsel of himself, but also angels. And so then God, and this is a increasingly popular view, it's based on study of ancient Near East practices and documents and stuff, but I don't think it really comports with the biblical evidence or, the history of Christian doctrine or anything of that sort. But anyway, the idea is then, so man is created in the image of God and the angels, and that image is a judiciary capacity that comes from these angels who are beings in God's counsel who judge. Now, the discussion of this can get pretty detailed and technical, but even just from the biblical evidence already presented, I mentioned texts in Colossians 3 and Ephesians 4 that talk about the image of God as restored, makes it something far greater than just this judicial capacity. And then there's also the issue of when you say created in the image of God and angels. I think that opens up a lot of issues regarding anthropology and the constitution of man that I think are problematic, but that's a bit of a side tangent, but also just showing one potential issue and divergent view as we approach this issue.
Yeah, and that gives a good introduction to a broad issue of what you call the capacity view, any kind of capacity view of man being made in the image of God. By judiciary capacity, you're meaning that in a sense, man is a legal creature, an ethical creature primarily. And so there's something of a emphasis then on the image of God being simply the ability to choose right and wrong, right? In this, to be able to choose goodness or wickedness, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a fair explanation of the position. But based on what we've already seen, I mean, it is more than mere ability to choose or recognize right and wrong. There's this righteousness and holiness, this true righteousness and holiness and knowledge that permeates the whole man, that permeates all of life, beyond just, making ethical choices and decisions.
So, and that's just precisely what you're saying then, that issue, that it's an ethical emphasis that man has, that the primary part of man's being made in the image of God is a exercise of the will. It is having this desire, that disposition, or this disposition. It is a focus on what is lost primarily as the will, and leaves something of an optimistic view of the use of the intellect, the reason, the mind, and a somewhat optimistic view of then affections, emotions, and whatnot. So you get other issues with other capacity views, ones that could so emphasize, the intellect was the intellectual capacity was the primary thing of man, the primary image of God. This could tend towards a certain rationalistic view, or just the emotions, the affections are the capacity view. So you can have an element so emphasized to the detriment of or reduction of the other aspects of man's what we call faculties, right? Of his attributes of knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. Another common issue, actually, I think that would be good to bring up really quick, is perhaps maybe even more popular as a whole, is ideas that come from a 4th century British monk, Pelagius, who thought that man wasn't created good or evil, but really neutral, Man was a blank tablet, a tabula rasa, he would say, having nothing written on him. He starts off as basically a total clean slate, not being inclined to good or bad, and that any vices or virtue, anything good or bad that man does or has in himself, is acquired through practice, through imitation, in built up by one's environment. So his idea of the image of God is that it's just normal, natural qualities of man, at least internally. He would also believe then that Adam was created mortal with death. And so death is a natural consequence, not a result of sin. Those are fairly common views still, but it is reducing man to basically a totally worldly creature. The things that happen after the fall, the results of the fall, are already there from the beginning in Pelagius's view.
Which you can kind of see influences and undergirds to a certain extent the Roman Catholic view that nature, at least, is essentially the same after the fall as it was before. All that's really changed is the loss of that super added gift.
Right. I mentioned last time, in this way you have super nature, the supernatural things, as an alternative reality to the things of this creation, this life. So yeah, that I would say that's something that comports well with Roman Catholicism, and it also works well with certain liberal or modern ideas of theology that are, complementary or kind to the ideas of Charles Darwin in evolution.
Yeah,
it's a naturalistic view of what man is. And basically, man is like the rest of the creatures.
Yeah.
And not the gem of man's creation. You get that same thing with what you brought up with the angels, too. Does man have share the image of God with angels? Well, we won't get into it, but I mean, is man not the gem of creation? What would this mean, then, if angels are also made in the image of God, which Scripture does not say? So we could leave that question hanging, not particularly address it, but I think that lays out the problem pretty well.
Maybe just to provoke some more thought on that, some other questions to leave open pertaining to that. If man is created in the image of angels, how do you deal with things like fallen man has a redeemer, but fallen angels don't, or a mediator or hope of salvation? It just opens up a lot of these kind of odd and speculative issues when we want to go there, but we don't really have the time, nor is it really on our topic.
Right.
And speaking of not having time, we are out of time for this week's episode of Once for All Delivered. We hope you'll join us again next time, where we'll take up this topic again of grace renewing nature, and we will look at how this applies to the fall and to redemption. So you don't want to miss that. If you have any questions, as always, you can reach us on social media at OFAD Podcast. You can visit our website at onceforalldelivered.com. We're running it on Substack, so if you want to support the show, there's options for you to do that and help us with the costs of putting this on. And we still need a pithy ending phrase, so we would definitely love to hear your ideas for our pithy ending catchphrase. And so, until next time, here's a placeholder for a pithy sign-off phrase.
Thank you for listening to this episode. For the latest news and updates, visit our Substack at onceforalldelivered.com, where you can also support our work with a paid subscription. You can also follow us on social media at OFAD Podcast. If you like what you have heard, leave a 5-star review where you get your podcasts, and spread the word about the show. Once for All Delivered is hosted by Andrew Smith and Caleb Castro, and produced by Andrew and Heidi Smith. We hope you will join us again next time on Once for All Delivered.